What if a single conversation could change the way we see the world? What if, in the span of just a few minutes, two strangers, seemingly worlds apart, found common ground in a way no one expected? This is the true story of a confrontation that started with anger, but ended with something far more powerful. It all happened on a quiet afternoon in Philadelphia, in a small corner cafe where no one expected history to be made. At the center of it all, Barron Trump. But it wasn't his name that made this moment unforgettable, it was what he did next. The scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the cafe, mingling with the quiet hum of conversation and the occasional clink of ceramic mugs. It was the kind of place where people came to escape the chaos of the outside world, to read, to work, or simply to enjoy a moment of peace. Barron Trump sat near the window, a thick book in his hands, his posture slightly hunched as he lost himself in its pages. Unlike the public persona often associated with his name, today he wasn't a politician's son. He was just another young man in a hoodie and jeans, seeking a few moments of anonymity. Or so he thought. The moment shattered like glass. "You think you're better than the rest of us?" The voice, sharp and cutting, sliced through the air. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. The cafe, once filled with warmth and quiet energy, now stood frozen in tension. Barron looked up, startled. A man, mid-40s, face lined with exhaustion, stood a few feet away. His clothes were worn but not tattered, his expression a mix of frustration, pain, and something deeper, something raw. The man's glare was locked onto Barron. "You've had everything handed to you on a silver platter," he continued, his voice trembling with barely contained anger. "Do you even know what it's like to struggle?" Silence. The kind of silence that pulls the air from the room. Heavy, unrelenting. The barista behind the counter hesitated, her hand hovering near the phone. A few customers shifted in their seats, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they hadn't heard. But Barron, he didn't flinch. Instead of meeting aggression with aggression, he did something no one expected. He closed his book gently, setting it aside as if he had all the time in the world. Then, meeting the man's fiery gaze with quiet confidence, he spoke. "Sir, I don't know what's upsetting you, but maybe we could talk about it." The man scoffed. "Talk? What could you possibly have to say that someone like me would want to hear?" The tension in the cafe tightened. People held their breath, but Barron didn't back down. Instead, he did something even more surprising. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Please," he said simply. "Sit." The offer landed like a punch, unexpected and disarming. The man's fists clenched at his sides, his body rigid with frustration. He looked at the chair as if it were a trap, his mind warring between pride and curiosity. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he yanked the chair back, the legs scraping against the floor. Dropping into the seat, arms crossed defensively, he glared at Barron. "Fine," he muttered. "You want to hear about the real world? I'll tell you." The anger in the man's voice hadn't faded, but something else had crept in. Weariness. "You look at me, and you see just another guy with a chip on his shoulder," he said, his fingers absently tracing the table's surface. "But you don't know what it's like to lose everything." The cafe was deathly quiet. "I had a job," the man continued, his voice thick with emotion. "A stable one, a family, a future. But then, the factory shut down, just like that. Gone. Hundreds of us left with nothing but empty promises. They said they'd relocate us, said we'd be taken care of. But the help never came. The jobs never came. I did everything I could to keep my family together. Worked odd jobs, scraped by however I could. But when you're barely making enough to survive, it doesn't take much to break you. And then, my wife left. She took the kids. Said she couldn't live like this anymore, and you know what? I don't even blame her." His voice cracked just for a moment. The bitterness in his tone wavered, replaced by something heavier. He looked down at the table, his fingers pressing against the wood as if grounding himself. "You don't know what it's like to walk into a room and feel like everyone's looking at you, judging you, assuming you're nothing." He exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. "And then I see someone like you," he continued, his voice rising with frustration. "Sitting here with your fancy clothes, your expensive education, reading a book like you don't have a care in the world. And it makes me mad." His hands curled into fists on the table. "Because no matter what I do, I'll never have what you have." The words hung in the air, thick with resentment. But Barron didn't react the way the man expected. He didn't get defensive, he didn't argue, he didn't even look offended. Instead, Barron did something that stunned the entire cafe. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the table, and spoke in a voice so calm, so steady, that it made everyone lean in just a little closer. "I don't know what it's like to be in your shoes," Barron said softly, "but I do know what it's like to be judged before I even open my mouth." The man's eyes narrowed. "What could you possibly know about that?" Barron took a deep breath. "People assume they know me because of my last name," he said. "They think they know my story, my beliefs, my struggles, but they don't. They see a name, and they make up their minds before I've even had a chance to prove who I really am." He held the man's gaze unwavering. "Kind of like what's happening here." The man's lips parted slightly as if he wanted to argue, but the words didn't come. For the first time, his posture softened, just a little. The cafe was silent now, not out of tension, but because everyone was listening. Barron continued, "I'm not saying my struggles are the same as yours, they're not. But pain is pain, feeling like you'll never be understood, like people see right through you without ever really knowing you. That's something we all face, no matter where we come from." The man swallowed hard, his fingers twitching against the table. Barron leaned back slightly, giving him space. "I'm not here to argue with you. I'm not even here to change your mind. I just want to understand, because I think we're all carrying things that no one else sees. And maybe, just maybe, we'd be a little kinder to each other if we did." The man let out a slow, shaky breath. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, finally, his shoulders slumped. "You really believe that?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Barron nodded. "I do. And I think deep down you do too. Otherwise, you wouldn't have told me your story." The man blinked. His tough exterior, the wall he had built up over years of struggle, cracked just a little more. He rubbed the back of his neck, glancing around the cafe as if realizing for the first time just how many people were watching. He sighed, shaking his head. "You're a strange kid," he muttered, a hint of something that almost resembled a chuckle beneath his breath. Barron smiled, but it wasn't smug, it wasn't victorious, it was just understanding. The tension that had wrapped around the cafe like a vice slowly began to loosen. The barista behind the counter let out a quiet breath. A couple in the corner exchanged glances. Someone near the back, who had been pretending to read, closed their book, realizing they had just witnessed something they wouldn't forget. The man across from Barron sat back in his chair, rubbing his face with both hands. He looked exhausted, not just physically, but in a way that came from carrying years of anger, of loss, of feeling like the world had turned its back on him. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel invisible. He looked at Barron again, but the anger was gone. All that remained was a tired man, sitting across from a young stranger who had done something no one else had. He had listened. After a long pause, the man exhaled, his shoulders dropping. "I don't even know why I got so mad at you," he admitted, shaking his head. You were there, and I was carrying too much." Barron nodded, as if he understood completely. "We all carry things," he said, "and sometimes we just need someone to notice." The man was quiet for a long time. Then, finally, hesitantly, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a few crumpled dollar bills and set them on the table. "For your coffee," he said gruffly. Barron blinked, surprised. "You don't have to. Just take it," the man interrupted. His voice wasn't angry anymore. It was something else. Something like gratitude. Barron hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Thank you." The man stood up, stuffing his hands into his pockets. He looked around at the cafe, at the people still pretending not to stare, and let out a breath. Then, turning back to Barron, he gave a small nod. Not of defeat, but of respect. And without another word, he walked out the door. The cafe remained silent for a few seconds longer. Then, slowly, conversations began to resume. The hum of life returned. But something had changed, because in a world where arguments so often end in division, this one had ended in something far more rare: understanding. Barron sat there for a moment, staring at the chair across from him, the space where just moments ago a stranger had sat, pouring out years of anger, of frustration, of pain. Then, he picked up his book again, but before he opened it, he did something else. He picked up the crumpled dollar bills, folded them carefully, and tucked them into his pocket. Not because he needed them, but because some things aren't about money. Some things are about human connection. And today, that's exactly what had happened. And so as the cafe returned to normal and as Barron turned back to his book, the world outside continued moving. But for at least two people, something was different. Something had shifted. Because sometimes all it takes to change the course of a moment is the courage to sit down and listen.